There is an Israeli flag flying right now over a medieval castle in southern Lebanon. That castle was built by crusaders in the 12th century. Israel captured it in 1982 during the invasion that began the longest and most costly occupation in Israeli military history, 18 years, 800 Israeli soldiers killed, a war that gave birth to Hezbollah, an occupation that ended in a humiliating withdrawal in May of the year 2000. Netanyahu raised that same Israeli flag over that same castle on May 31st, 2026, and declared that Israel had returned stronger than ever. History suggests exactly the opposite. And while the world celebrates the memorandum of understanding signed between the United States and Iran on June 14th, 2026, while Trump posts on Truth Social that the ships of the world should start their engines and let the oil flow, there are more than 1 million Lebanese civilians who cannot return to their homes. There are between 570 and 600 square kilometers of Lebanese territory under Israeli military occupation. There is an Israeli finance minister who said publicly on Israeli radio that the new border of Israel must be the Litani River. And there is an Israeli prime minister who declared just hours after celebrating peace with Iran that Israel will remain in the security buffer zone in southern Lebanon for as long as necessary. Nobody in the framework of the agreement between the United States and Iran has the leverage or the will to force Israel out. And the history of that castle tells you exactly where this goes next. Let me build the complete picture for you because mainstream coverage is not connecting these threads with the clarity they deserve. On March 16th, 2026, Israel began its ground invasion of Lebanon. This was not a strategic surprise. It was the culmination of an escalation that had been visible for weeks. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran on February 28th, 2026, Hezbollah in Lebanon saw what analysts described as its existential moment. It began launching drones and rockets toward northern Israel, giving the Israel Defense Forces the pretext they needed for a full-scale ground invasion. The IDF responded with sustained airstrikes and ground operations across southern Lebanon, moving beyond short cross-border incursions and pushing deeper toward the Litani River. Within days, Israeli strikes expanded to bridges, roads, and homes near the border. Israel destroyed every single bridge crossing the Litani River, not some of them, all of them. The Kashmir Bridge connecting the southern cities of Tyre and Sidon was destroyed. The Zaria Bridge was struck. Every crossing over that river was eliminated deliberately and systematically. The strategy was described by analysts at Modern Diplomacy with total precision. Israel was cutting the geographic lifeline of southern Lebanon from the rest of the country. Without bridges, no weapons can move south. Without bridges, no aid can move south. Without bridges, refugees cannot go home. Southern Lebanon was sealed off. By the time a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was declared on April 17th, 2026, the IDF had expanded its military occupation inside Lebanon to a total of between 570 and 600 square kilometers. That amounts to roughly 10% of Lebanon's entire territory, 1/10 of a sovereign country under military occupation. Israel established what it called a yellow line roughly 10 kilometers inside southern Lebanon, similar to the line in Gaza that separates areas held by Israeli forces from those controlled by Hamas. The comparison is not incidental, it is official policy. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz declared on March 31st, 2026, that at the end of the operation, the IDF would establish itself in a security zone inside Lebanon on a defensive line against anti-tank missiles and would maintain security control over the entire area up to the Litani. Katz said this with total clarity, not as ambition, but as declared policy. And Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich went even further. Smotrich said on Israeli radio that the military campaign in Lebanon needs to end with a completely different reality, one that includes a change of Israel's borders. He then said this definitively in every room and in every discussion. The new Israeli border must be the Litani. The finance minister of the Israeli government was openly calling for the annexation of a sovereign portion of another country, the equivalent of what happened with the Golan Heights, but larger. The French Foreign Ministry responded immediately. Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot condemned the occupation plan and warned of severe humanitarian consequences, urging Israeli authorities to refrain from ground operations that would worsen an already dire situation. But verbal condemnations did not move a single Israeli soldier. The IDF continued advancing. The bridges remained destroyed, and the occupation continued consolidating on the ground while diplomacy produced statements without consequences. The human number behind these square kilometers is what turns this story from geopolitics into a humanitarian crisis of the first order. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric confirmed that more than 1.2 million people, 1 in every 5 Lebanese residents, were displaced. That represents roughly 16% of Lebanon's total population. More than 130,000 people, including 46,000 children, were sheltering in more than 600 collective sites across the country, most already at full capacity. Tens of thousands more were sleeping in vehicles or on the streets of Beirut. The Lebanese Health Ministry reported more than 1,039 dead and nearly 2,876 wounded just through March 24th, including children and health workers. And Human Rights Watch documented on June 11th, 2026, that Israeli displacement and killings of civilians continued unabated despite the declared ceasefire of April 17th. On June 7th and June 9th, Israel ordered all residents of the southern Lebanese city of Tyre and its surrounding towns and refugee camps to leave their homes. This happened weeks after the ceasefire was declared. This happened while Trump was announcing 38 separate times that the peace deal with Iran was close. And today, just days after Trump announced the Iran deal is complete, those more than 1 million displaced Lebanese still cannot go home. This is where the story of Beaufort Castle becomes the most important analysis you can do about the future of this occupation, because Israel has occupied southern Lebanon before, twice, and the history of those two occupations is the only honest map available for understanding where this goes. The first time was in 1978 during what was called the Litani operation. Israel invaded southern Lebanon to push the PLO beyond the Litani River. After a week of fighting, the PLO withdrew, and the UN Security Council passed Resolution 425 establishing the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, which still operates today. Israel formally withdrew, but left behind proxy Lebanese militias to maintain control over 700 square kilometers. That structure of indirect control did not eliminate the threat. It postponed it temporarily while planting the conditions for something far more dangerous. In 1982, Israel returned, this time in what it called Operation Peace for Galilee. The declared objective was to remove the PLO from Lebanon and install a pro-Israeli government in Beirut. Israeli forces besieged the Lebanese capital. By the end of 1982, nearly 20,000 people had died and 30,000 more had been wounded. That invasion gave birth to Hezbollah, formed in direct response to the Israeli occupation, supervised by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and built into the most militarily sophisticated non-state actor in the history of the Middle East. Hezbollah fought a guerrilla war for 18 years. It struck Israeli positions. It inflicted consistent casualties. It eroded Israeli political will to sustain the occupation. And in May of the year 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in what Israelis themselves recognized as a retreat produced by strategic defeat at the hands of armed resistance. 800 Israeli casualties, 18 years of occupation. And in the end, Hezbollah emerged stronger than when it had entered. The analysis published in The Conversation put it with brutal precision. The news of the IDF's occupation of Beaufort Castle on May 31st, 2026, should bring grim memories for Israelis. That castle remains etched in the collective memory of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon between 1982 and 2000 as a symbol of its failure. Netanyahu packaged the occupation as a sign of strength, declaring that Israel returned stronger than ever. History suggests otherwise. The same analysis captured the fundamental difference between 1982 and 2026 that makes the current situation even more dangerous than the previous one. In 1982, under Ariel Sharon, Israel's objective was political, installing a pro-Israeli government in Beirut through an alliance with Maronite Christians. That ambition collapsed with the assassination of Bashir Gemayel and dragged Israel into 18 years of occupation. In 2026, Israel abandoned the political engineering approach completely. The shift moved toward physical and territorial domination. Israel is no longer preoccupied with seeking local allies to manage Lebanon. Instead, it is applying what analysts call the Gaza model in southern Lebanon. The Gaza model means absolute territorial control. It means demolition of villages that Hezbollah used for military purposes. It means destruction of civilian land registration records. It means construction of permanent fortifications on every occupied square meter. It means displacement of the civilian population as deliberate policy rather than collateral consequence. The Gaza model in Lebanon has already produced the displacement of 1 in every 5 Lebanese citizens. It is now producing an occupation that Israel's own finance minister describes as the permanent new border of the country. The operation, called Eternal Darkness, executed on April 8, 2026, was described as one of the bloodiest days of the previous 100 days of war. Israel launched more than 100 strikes in less than 10 minutes, killing more than 350 people. 100 strikes, less than 10 minutes, 350 people dead. That number is not an abstract statistic. It is the dimension of firepower Israel is systematically applying over territory it now says it will hold indefinitely. And that firepower was executed under the command of the most right-wing cabinet in Israeli history, a cabinet where the finance minister calls for annexation, where the defense minister declares Lebanese civilians civilians cannot return until Hezbollah is defeated, and where the prime minister raises flags over conquered medieval castles and declares Israel returns stronger than ever. There is a question the framework of the agreement between the United States and Iran on June 14th forces us to ask directly and honestly. The Memorandum of Understanding explicitly included the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said this specifically when he announced the deal, including in Lebanon. But Netanyahu declared today, June 16th, that Israel is not party to the negotiated agreement, that Israel will remain in the security zone in southern Lebanon for as long as necessary, that Israel will continue to target what he calls Iran's terrorist arms, his way of describing Hezbollah, and that it will need to keep watching in the north. In plain language, Netanyahu told the world that the agreement between the United States and Iran does not bind him in any way, that the occupation continues, that Lebanese civilians still cannot return, and that Israel unilaterally defines how long this situation lasts. Nobody in the framework of the agreement has the leverage to change that. Trump needs the deal politically. He cannot afford a confrontation with Netanyahu that endangers the memorandum before it is signed on June 19th in Switzerland. The European Union issued statements. The Lebanese government has no military capacity to confront the IDF. UNIFIL was struck during the conflict, and Hezbollah, weakened but not eliminated, remains the only force with both the motivation and the capacity to resist the occupation over the long term. That combination of factors, Netanyahu without effective external constraints, a weakened but present Hezbollah, Lebanese civilians locked out of their homes, and a peace deal that explicitly named Lebanon, but excludes the actor who actually determines what happens on Lebanese ground, is the exact formula that produced 18 years of occupation between 1982 and 2000. The difference between 1982 and 2026 that makes the current cycle potentially longer and more costly is precisely the one identified by the modern diplomacy analysis. In 1982, Israel still sought to manage Lebanese politics through local allies. That gave it an eventual political exit. When the Allies failed, Israel could withdraw, declaring the political project had ended. In 2026, Israel adopted the direct territorial domination model. That does not carry the same exit. Once you build permanent fortifications, once you destroy civilian land registration records, once your finance minister declares the Litani River is the new border of Israel, the only available exit is the one that produced the withdrawal of the year 2000. The sustained cost of maintaining an occupation against a resistance that cannot be eliminated militarily eventually becomes politically unsustainable, and that process takes years, not weeks or months. The speed of Israeli troop movements on the ground in the early months of 2026 showed highly mature logistical and intelligence preparation, far exceeding the efficiency of similar operations in previous years, according to the modern diplomacy analysis. That means this occupation was not improvised. It was planned with fortifications, with infrastructure, with the intent to last. The analysis of what comes next produces three scenarios worth evaluating honestly. The first scenario is negotiated withdrawal under a new multilateral framework. In this scenario, the 60-day window of nuclear negotiations that began with the June 14th memorandum produces a broader agreement that includes verifiable Hezbollah commitments to withdraw north of the Litani and disarm in the areas occupied by Israel. In exchange, Israel withdraws its forces from the 570 to 600 square kilometers and allows the displaced to return. This is the most optimistic scenario and the least probable in the short term because it requires Netanyahu to accept something his own finance minister calls betrayal of Israel's new border, and it requires Hezbollah, already forced north of the Litani once in 2024 without complying, to fulfill disarmament commitments that run directly against its reason for existing. The second scenario is indefinite occupation with growing resistance. In this scenario, Israel maintains the 570 to 600 square kilometers while Hezbollah reorganizes its forces north of the Litani, receives Iranian support in the form of weapons and training, and begins a low-intensity guerrilla campaign similar to the one waged between 1985 and 2000. Israeli casualties accumulate gradually. The political cost of the occupation grows. The Lebanese economy, already devastated, cannot recover without access to the south of the country, and the more than 1 million displaced remain in limbo for months or years. This is the most probable scenario in the short and medium term. It is the one the 1982 to 2000 history describes with the greatest precision, and it is the one nobody in the framework of the agreement between the United States and Iran has either the tool or the political will to prevent. The third scenario is escalation through miscalculation. In this scenario, a specific incident, a Hezbollah operation that kills enough Israeli soldiers to require a response, an Israeli strike on Lebanese territory north of the Litani that Iran interprets as a violation of the memorandum or a provocation from any of the non-state armed actors operating in the area, detonates an escalation that endangers the June 19th deal before its terms can consolidate. Netanyahu declared today that if Israel is attacked again, it will strike Beirut and Hezbollah directly. Hezbollah declared the occupation an existential threat to Lebanon and promised fierce resistance. Those two statements on the same day a peace deal is being celebrated contain the seed of every possible escalation scenario. Here are the three specific things to watch over the next 30 days to know which of these three scenarios is taking shape. Watch whether Israel allows any displaced person to return to any area of southern Lebanon in the coming weeks. Today, no civilian can return. Defense Minister Katz explicitly said Lebanese civilians will not be allowed back until Hezbollah is defeated. If that policy does not change in the coming weeks, despite the memorandum, that is the clearest possible confirmation that Israel does not consider the terms of the agreement between the United States and Iran binding on its operations in Lebanon. Watch whether Hezbollah executes any armed operation inside the 570 to 600 square kilometers under occupation. Hezbollah spent months dismantling Israeli surveillance before the 2026 invasion, according to published analysis, and it maintains an extensive tunnel network in southern Lebanon built over decades precisely to operate under occupation. If Hezbollah begins guerrilla attacks inside the occupied zone, scenario 2, indefinite occupation with growing resistance, has officially begun. And watch what Trump says about Lebanon in his Truth Social posts in the coming days. If Trump mentions Lebanon in the context of the deal and demands some verifiable change in Israeli behavior, that suggests Washington is trying to manage the contradiction between a memorandum that named Lebanon and an Israeli occupation that contradicts its terms. If Trump says nothing about Lebanon at all, that is confirmation Washington has decided to let Netanyahu handle Lebanon his own way, while Washington focuses entirely on the 60-day nuclear window. Netanyahu raised the Israeli flag over Beaufort Castle on May 31st, 2026, and said Israel returned stronger than ever. That castle was captured in 1982. That occupation lasted 18 years. It ended with Israel withdrawing under pressure from a resistance that the region's most powerful air force could not eliminate militarily in nearly 2 decades. Today, there is an Israeli flag over that same castle. There are more than 1 million Lebanese who cannot go home. There are between 570 and 600 square kilometers of sovereign territory under military occupation. There is a finance minister calling for permanent annexation. And there is a prime minister who said today Israel will stay for as long as necessary. The agreement between the United States and Iran explicitly named Lebanon, but the man who actually controls Lebanon on the ground said today he is not party to that agreement. The story of Beaufort Castle is not just a historical footnote. It is the most honest map available for where this situation is headed. And that map says the question is not whether resistance to this occupation will come. The question is how long it takes for that resistance to make the political cost of maintaining it unsustainable. Tell me in the comments right now, do you think the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon ends in a negotiated agreement within the next few months? Or are we watching the beginning of another 18-year occupation that ends exactly the same way the last one did? Your answer reveals exactly what lesson you think Israel learned from its own history. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens in southern Lebanon over the coming weeks will determine whether the June 19th agreement in Switzerland holds or collapses before the ink is even dry.